Hello and welcome. So today's video is going to be all about King James VI of Scotland, who did become King James I of England. And this is, I don't know if this is the first time that a video about a certain English, Scottish, British monarch has ended up being the same as my picture that I have up, but this is King James VI of Scotland, first of England. So this thing that happened to King James happened when he was still just only King of Scotland. So, of course, he'll be referred to as King James VI of Scotland throughout this video. So, the raid of Riven and the Gowrie House conspiracy involved the kidnapping of King James VI of Scotland and the death of two Earls of Gowrie. So James VI of Scotland was born on the 19th of June 1566. He was the only child of Mary Queen of Scots and Henry Stuart Lord Darnley. So James became King of Scotland on the 24th of July 1567 at the age of 1 year old after his mother abdicated in his favour. He later became King of England on the 24th of March 1603 after the death of Queen Elizabeth I of England. So while he was still just King of Scotland, there was a political conspiracy to kidnap James. This took place on the 23rd of August 1582 and involved many Scottish nobles who were led by William Riven, 1st Earl of Gowrie. Their aim was to limit the influence of the French and limit pro-Catholic policy and just completely reform the Scottish government. So on the 23rd of August, James was hunting near Riven Castle near Perthshire, which, as you guessed, was the home of the Earl of Gowrie. So he was captured while out hunting and taken to the castle by the conspirators, who the 17th century historian David Calderwood said were the Earl of Gowrie, the Earl of Mar, the Master of Glamis, the Laird of Easterweemis, Lewis Bellenden, who was a lawyer, Robert Boyd, 5th Lord Boyd, Patrick Lindsay, 6th Lord Lindsay, the Abbot of Dunfermline, the Abbot of Paisley, the Prior of Pittenweem, and the Constable of Dundee. So James was only around 16 years old at the time of his kidnapping, and he was kept prisoner for 10 months. There were attempts to rescue James by Esme Stuart, the 1st Duke of Lennox, and by James Stuart, the Earl of Arran. But the attempts were not successful, with the Earl of Lennox being sent into exile and the Earl of Arran and his brother being captured. So the Lord started to move James around the place. He was first taken to Perth, where the Earl of Gowrie had a house, and then he was taken to Stirling Castle. He was eventually taken to Holyrood Palace in Edinburgh. So the conspirators were effectively in control of the government. James was still king, but they were basically in control of him. But the new Gowrie regime did not last long, and in July 1583, James managed to escape. So revenge was taken on those who kidnapped him, but it wasn't what you would expect. There was no mass executions or anything like that. The conspirators were just removed from court, and their followers, who were paid court servants, were just sacked. He even pardoned the Earl of Gowrie. Now, you would have thought that after he had kidnapped the king, held him prisoner for 10 months, tried to take over the Scottish government, your only punishment being pardoned by the king, you would have thought the Earl of Gowrie would have just gone away, lived his life with his family, thanking his lucky stars that he wasn't losing his head or anything. But he did not do this. He carried on plotting against the king and was eventually executed for high treason. But this was not the end of the Gowrie family's dealings with the king. John Riven, the 3rd Earl of Gowrie, was born around 1577. He was the second son of William Riven, the 1st Duke of Gowrie. So after the execution of his father in 1584, his brother James became the 2nd Earl of Gowrie, but he died just 2 years later. And John became the 3rd Earl. Now, it seems that the Gowrie family had a hatred for King James VI of Scotland. In 1593, John's mother Dorothea and his sister, the Countess of Atholl, helped Francis Stuart, the 5th Earl of Bothwell, force himself into the king's bedroom in Holyrood Palace with a sword in his hand. A few months later, John, along with the Earls of Atholl and Montrose, offered their services to Queen Elizabeth I of England. He wanted to seek vengeance on James for the execution of his father, so he came up with a plan. On the 5th of August 1600, King James was hunting near Falkland Palace, which is near Perth, which is near where the Gowries lived. While out hunting, James was approached by John's younger brother, Alexander. Alexander told the king that he and his brother had this foreigner at their house who was carrying a very large amount of money, and they wanted the king to come and speak to the foreigner himself to find out what was going on. James was at first hesitant to go back to the Gowries' home with him because of the history between him and the family, but eventually he agreed to do so. But he said that he didn't want to go until his hunt was over. Alexander urged the king to not waste any time, and he also told the king to keep it a secret from his courtiers and to bring along with him as small a retinue as possible. And for some reason, James listened to him and did exactly what he said. So James and 15 of his retainers went to the Gowries' home, and they got there about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. After eating, James told his retainers to stay where they are, and he went up the main staircase with Alexander. They passed through 2 chambers and 2 doors, which were locked behind them, and then they eventually came to a room in a turret in which James expected to find the foreigner with all the money. But inside this room was one man. He was armed, and he was the Earl of Galway's servant, Henderson. Alexander pulled Henderson's dagger and threatened to kill the king if he ever attempted to open a window or call for help. If the king stayed quiet, then he would be fine. He then left the room, and James questioned Henderson as to what was going on, and Henderson said that he did not know. Henderson was probably lying about this. He obviously knew what was going to happen, but he told the king that he didn't know, probably to cover himself. James then asked Henderson to open a window, which Henderson did. Alexander then returned to the room. Now, while this was going on, John the Earl was telling everyone that James had just taken a horse and ridden off. And believing this to be true, James's men started getting ready to leave themselves. So Alexander returned to the room where the king and Henderson was, and when he got there, he attempted to bind James's hands together. There was a struggle, and the king managed to get near the open window and began to yell treason. His men, who were outside in the courtyard getting ready to leave, saw him in the window and heard him yelling treason. So they ran back into the house to go and help him. But of course, they found all these doors locked in their way, so they couldn't get through to the king. But then John Ramsay, who is part of the king's men, he saw this small little dark staircase that led up to the room that was right next to the room where James was being held. He ran up those stairs, and Henderson, who must have known what his masters were going to do but didn't want to do it himself and thought it was a bad idea, he must have thought this because he actually let John Ramsay into the room through the door that connected. Now, inside the room, John Ramsay found the king and Alexander struggling together, so he stabbed Alexander. Alexander was then pushed down the stairway before being killed by Thomas Erskine and Dr. Hugh Harris. Now, John the Earl returned to the courtyard where he saw his younger brother's dead body. So he went after Erskine and Harris, but he too was killed. So the government's official line was the Gowrie brothers were trying to kill the king, so to protect the king, they were killed. But there were many people who thought that James had invented the story about the Gowrie conspiracy to get rid of the family. It didn't help this belief when James went after the 2 younger brothers of the Earl, who didn't have anything to do with anything and were just completely innocent. So on the 7th of October 1600, the Privy Council ordered that John and Alexander's bodies were not to be buried, and that no family member of theirs was to come within 10 miles of the court. On the 20th of November, Parliament declared that the estates of the Rivens were forfeited to the Crown, and the family name and honours became extinct. The bodies of John and Alexander were hanged and quartered in Edinburgh. Their heads were put on spikes at Edinburgh Old Toll Booth, and their arms and legs were put on spikes at various points around Perth. So there's a little video about the kidnapping of King James VI of Scotland. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Bye.